Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and joining us again to discuss financial regulatory reform is Jerry Epstein, coming from Amherst, Massachusetts. He's the co-founder of the Perry Institute, and he joins us from the Perry Institute. Thanks for joining us again, Jerry.
Thank you.
So we left off with the question, how do we make rainmakers accountable in these finance firms?
There are several things we have to do to make these rainmakers stop crashing these financial institutions and putting the whole international financial system at risk. One thing we have to do is break up the banks. They're too big to manage, they're too big to regulate, and then if they do fail, as we said in the last segment, it holds the whole economy hostage. So in the Senate bill, the Dodd bill at the moment, there's virtually nothing that will prevent these banks from getting too big. There is a Volcker amendment in the Senate bill which limits proprietary trading to some extent by some of these banks.
Okay, let's just explain one more time what proprietary trading is.
Proprietary trading is trading by these large banks with their own capital, in risky trades, hedge funds, collateralized debt obligations, and so forth. We can come back a bit to the Volcker rule in a minute. But in this rule, there's a very limited restriction on size of banks. It just says that banks can't grow any bigger than they already are through mergers or acquisitions. The problem is a number of these banks are already too big. So we need to cut them down to size so they don't threaten the system and they're easier to manage. That's number one.
And there's nothing in the current legislation that does that.
That's correct. However, there is an amendment that's going to be coming forward by Senator Brown and Senator Kaufman, which with very good size limitations. It says that banks cannot grow, their assets can't grow larger than 3% of GDP, and investment banks can't grow larger than 2% of GDP.
But aren't some of these banks already pretty close to there or there?
Some of these banks are already close, and some of the largest banks, Bank of America, Citibank, I believe, Goldman Sachs, would have to be cut down, would have to have their size reduced as a result of these limitations. The bill by Senators Brown and Senators Kaufman would give a 3-year period for them to do this. They can choose how to cut themselves down, but I believe that this is a very important amendment and should be supported very strongly by anybody.
And does it have support from the White House?
I'm not aware that it has support from the White House or from the Treasury.
I mean, isn't this one of the problems that in terms of the amendments that actually have more teeth, you don't really have White House willing to pay its political capital to see them through? It's something like the health care legislation.
That's correct. But there's an odd politics happening now on the Senate, I believe, where some of these bills, which clearly attack some of these issues that Republicans care about, may in the end get some Republican support. So it may not need so much White House support. So this is number one. We have to end the too big to fail. And that will make it much easier to control these rainmakers, or if you don't control the rainmakers, at least it won't crash the system. The second thing that has to be done is there has to be compensation reform. This is something that Jim Crotty and I talked about in our paper. The way it works now is that these rainmakers can make enormous bets, and they make money whether they win or they lose, and whether we win or we lose. This has to be outlawed in some way, through clawbacks, that is, they have to give the money back if the bank fails, through escrow accounts where you hold the money in the long term to make sure that these bets are paying off, through the tax system, or even caps on compensation. And there's absolutely nothing in the Senate bill or in the House bill that will do this. And there's no serious amendments that I'm aware of that are going to do this as well. So this is a serious flaw in all of the legislation.
Yeah, you see that in the recent charges of the SEC against Goldman Sachs. Part of Goldman Sachs' defense was that, in fact, in that particular transaction they're being charged for, they said they actually did invest in the upside gamble of that particular horse race, and they lost. What they don't mention is how much bonus money was earned by the people putting the deal together, even if the firm lost money.
Absolutely. So even if Goldman Sachs lost on this deal, which I'm skeptical about because they had many other bets going on tied to the same securities as well, so who knows net what they really ended up doing. But you're absolutely right. The people who made these deals came away with enormous bonuses, even if they did make a loss.
But let's go back to the first point again about the issue of too big to fail and what we talked about in the first segment of structural blackmail. Even if the better legislation passes that's on the table, and I understand what you're saying, that it's better than the way the bills have been written so far, but you're still left with a system that can fail, even if it's not just one bank. But if you're in a situation where 5, 10 of the major banks are back in the same boat, ready to sink, you can't unwind them all. You can't, even if you've limited the growth of a particular bank to a certain percentage of GDP, the 5 or 10 of them are still going to be so big that the whole system's going to be back in dire straits again. What I'm getting at is there any real solution short of some kind of public alternative that if liquidity and the banking system's so in threat, there's some kind of quote-unquote public option that can kick in here?
Excellent points. And for a long time, I've been arguing that there has to be a public option in banking. That is, we have to have public alternatives to finance investment, to finance Main Street, to finance small businesses, large businesses. That's what Keynes argued for a large public option in financing investment. There's a movement now to create state banks in the United States, like we have in North Dakota, to finance small businesses and so forth. So this clearly has to be on the table. But this won't itself be sufficient either. What we have to do is find other ways to curb those kinds of risky behaviors that can crash the system, as you said, even if only small banks are doing it. So one of the key pieces that Karate and I talked about is getting these dangerous financial products under control. These credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations that were at the heart of this SEC suit against Goldman Sachs, for example, these should never have been sold in the first place. The danger of these kinds of products on which these bankers, these rainmakers, made millions and millions of dollars in bonuses, this has to be stopped. There are two ways to stop this. One is to make sure that all of these products, every single one of them, are sold on exchanges. Now, what would that do? If you sell them on exchanges, they have to be transparent enough, they have to be homogeneous enough, they have to be simple enough that the exchange will be willing to let them be sold. Because
so you're talking on one stock exchange or the other?
That's right.
Which already has a certain amount of regulatory environment built into it.
It has regulatory environment built into it. Moreover, it's the capital that's at risk when these are sold on exchanges is the capital of the people who own the exchanges. So they really have skin in the game, and they don't want these products sold that are non-transparent. Now, the Agricultural Committee, as you mentioned, passed legislation. And this was kind of a surprise that Blanche Lincoln from Arkansas really pushed this legislation that would require a lot, if not most, of these securities to be sold on exchanges. Now, I haven't seen the latest markup that just came out today. There may be a number of exemptions in this that will drive holes through this legislation. But if not, this is a big step forward because it will make it impossible for these banks to continue to sell these highly risky securities to each other and to unsuspecting end users instead of putting them on exchanges. So that's number one.
The other piece of this is that there's these credit default things that happen with the subprime mortgage and bundling all these lousy debt obligations together as speculative investments. That's one thing. So you put that on an exchange, it builds in theory a little more rigor into that. But the other piece is what they're calling these synthetic investments, which, if I understand it correctly, it's just essentially are straightforward casinos. You might as well be at a racetrack betting on a horse race. You're betting on whether a package of securities is going to go up or go down. You don't own any of the securities. It's a completely fabricated investment. And I mean, I don't understand why there doesn't seem to be even be any conversation about telling Wall Street, if you want to do this, go to Atlantic City or Vegas. Don't call this banking.
You're absolutely right. There is a conversation, interestingly, going on in England about this. Adair Turner, the head of the Financial Services Authority there, Mervyn King, who's the head of the Bank of England, other regulators in England, have been saying, look, the financial system is too big, it's too much like a casino, We've got to cut it down to size, and we have to stop it from engaging in these Ponzi schemes and these casino activities and have it start doing real banking. This conversation isn't going on nearly enough here. Now, one of the things that Claudia and I proposed in our paper was we need an institution like the Food and Drug Administration that has to test these products before they're sold and to make sure that they're safe and effective. A lot of these products are created just to gamble, and a lot of them are also created just to allow rich people to evade taxes or to evade regulations. If these firms had to get permission before they could sell these products, it'd be much less likely that these incredibly risky and dangerous products would be sold in the first place. So we argued for a financial precautionary principle, that the burden should be on those wanting to sell these products to prove that they're safe and effective ahead of time. And there was talk about this when the crisis first occurred, but this has now completely left the arena of discussion, and I think it should be back in.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about some of the other specifics in what the legislation that's in front of Congress now, a little more about your proposals, and then let's talk about sort of the bigger picture, whether the political paralysis or the what you call the Lords of Finance, who so far have more or less owned Congress, whether what we're going to see through all this legislation is essentially in the end something so watered down that it's not effective at all, but they can call it a victory, which we've seen recently. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Jerry Epstein on the Real News Network.